He grabbed her arm in front of everyone on that platform and laughed. Not a quiet, uncomfortable laugh. A loud, carrying, cruel kind of laugh that made strangers stop walking and turn to look. "This is who you are?" Walter Greer said, loud enough for the ticket master, the porter, the three women waiting near the baggage cart to hear every word. He stepped back and looked Eliza Harrow up and down like she was something he'd ordered from a catalog that had arrived damaged. "You said you were a handsome woman. You said—" He shook his head and laughed again. "Lord Almighty!" Eliza didn't move. She stood with her traveling bag in one hand and her spine perfectly straight, and she did not cry. Not in front of him. Not in front of any of them. "Walter, don't!" He held up his hand. "Don't you say a single word. I brought you out here based on what you told me in those letters. I made arrangements. I told people." His voice dropped, got uglier. "You wasted my time." He turned around and walked away. Just like that. He didn't look back once. The platform went quiet. Or maybe the noise was still there and Eliza just couldn't hear it anymore through the roaring in her ears. If you were standing in her boots right now, no money, no room, no one coming back for you, winter already sharp in the mountain air, what would you do? Before we go any further, if this kind of story speaks to you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people who find extraordinary courage in the hardest moments. Hit the like button too, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that platform in Ash Hollow, because what Eliza does next is something none of those strangers and none of us will ever forget. The train had been 3 days late out of Millfield. That wasn't unusual for the mountain routes in October, when the first hard winds came down off the peaks, and the rail crews had to clear debris off the tracks every 30 miles or so. Eliza had spent most of those 3 days in the last car, squeezed into a window seat with her bag on her lap because the overhead rack was already full by the time she boarded, and she hadn't wanted to make a fuss asking someone to rearrange things. That was Eliza's way. She didn't make fusses. She'd spent most of her 34 years learning how not to take up too much space, how to be useful without being loud about it, how to want things quietly so that when those things didn't work out, the disappointment was hers alone to carry. She'd had the window seat at least. She'd watched the flat country give way to hills, the hills give way to real mountains, pine trees thick and dark on the slopes, and she'd let herself feel something that she almost didn't recognize because she'd been careful not to feel it too much. Hope. Just a careful, small, guarded amount of it. Enough to keep her spine straight during the ride. Walter Greer had found her through a correspondence arrangement, the kind advertised in certain newspapers for men in frontier territories who needed wives and women in eastern towns who needed new starts. The advertisement had been brief and practical. Widower. Established business. Ash Hollow, Colorado Territory. Looking for a sensible woman of steady character. Eliza had answered because she was sensible. She was the steadiest person she knew. She'd spent 6 years nursing her mother through a long illness, managing a household on less money than most people could imagine. And when her mother finally passed in March, she discovered that everything, the house, the small savings, every last piece of furniture, had been quietly borrowed against to pay the medical costs. The lawyer had been kind about it, which somehow made it worse. She'd had $42, a traveling bag, and a letter from Walter Greer saying he was pleased by her letters, that she seemed like exactly the kind of woman Ash Hollow needed, and that he would be waiting at the station. She had not lied to him. She had told him she was a large woman, a working woman, a plain speaker who didn't have much patience for pretense. She'd written those things directly, because she believed in being honest about who she was, so that no one ended up surprised, and she ended up humiliated. He had written back, "Character is what matters. I am not a man interested in decoration." She had believed him. That was the thing she couldn't stop thinking about on that platform after he walked away. She had believed him because she had wanted to, and she had known, that wanting a thing badly enough could make a person see only what they needed to see. The cold came in fast off the mountains. Eliza stood on the platform for a long time after Walter disappeared into town. She was aware that people were glancing at her, Not cruelly, most of them. Just the way people glance at someone standing alone in a place they should be leaving. The ticket master came outside at some point and asked if she was waiting for another train. "No," she said. "You got somewhere to be, ma'am?" Eliza looked at him. He was maybe 50, with a windburned face and the kind of careful politeness that came from years of dealing with difficult situations at a ticket window. "Not at the moment," she said. He nodded slowly. "There's a rooming house on Mill Street. Mrs. Calloway runs it. She's fair." "Thank you." She picked up her bag and walked off the platform. The rooming house on Mill Street had a sign in the window that said, "Rooms available," and Eliza stood outside it for a minute doing arithmetic she already knew the answer to. A room for one night would cost somewhere between 50 cents and $1. She had $2.14 left after the train fare. If she spent money on a room tonight, she would have enough for perhaps 3 days. Less if she needed to eat. She kept walking. Ash Hollow was not a big town, but it was bigger than she'd expected. There was a main street with a general store, a bank, a land office, a saloon that she could smell before she could see. There were side streets with houses, some of them painted, some of them just weathered wood that had gone silver with the years. There was a church and a schoolhouse and a livery stable with a boy mucking out a stall who stared at her openly as she walked past. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. She was walking because she needed to think, and she thought better when she moved, and because standing still on that platform had been as much stillness as she could manage for one day. She had no plan. That was the part that sat in her chest like a stone. Eliza Harrow, who always had a plan, who had planned her way through 6 years of grief and exhaustion and shrinking resources, was standing in a mountain town she'd never seen before with $2.14 and no plan. She stopped in front of the general store and looked at the items in the window. Canned goods, a bolt of blue cloth, a display of boot jacks. Her reflection floated over all of it, ghostly and strange. A large woman in a good wool coat that was starting to show wear at the cuffs, hair that had come loose from its pins somewhere during the 3-day train ride, eyes that were dry because she had made them be dry, and they were going to stay that way. "Ma'am," she turned. A man in a sheriff's badge was leaning against the post near the store entrance. He was younger than she expected, maybe 40, with a straight, unremarkable face and eyes that had the particular quality of a person who is paid to notice things. "I don't mean to intrude," he said, though his tone suggested he was going to anyway. "I saw what happened at the station." "Did you?" It wasn't a question. "Walter Greer is not a popular man in this town," the sheriff said, "for what that's worth." "It's not worth very much to me right now." The sheriff nodded like he'd expected that. "You came all this way." "From where?" "Millfield." He let out a low breath. "That's 3 days, give or take." "Give or take." There was a silence. A wagon went past on the main street, the horses blowing steam in the cold air. "You got people here?" the sheriff asked. "Anyone to call on?" "No." "You got a plan?" Eliza almost laughed. "I'm working on one." He studied her for a moment, not unkindly, not the way Walter had looked at her. This was a different kind of looking. The assessing look of someone deciding whether to spend their time on a problem. "There's a man," the sheriff said slowly. "Gideon Ashcroft. Has a ranch up the North Road about 4 miles. Been running it alone since his wife passed 2 winters ago. He's got 4 children, the youngest, not yet 5, and this time of year the mountain work piles up faster than one man can manage." He paused. "He's not easy. I'll tell you that straight. He doesn't talk much, and he doesn't like charity, and he's got a pride problem, though he'd call it something else." "What would he call it?" "Independence." The sheriff almost smiled. "But the fact is, he needs help, and he won't ask for it, and his children are going to have a harder winter than they should because he'd rather work himself to the bone than admit that." Eliza looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" The sheriff looked back at her. "Because you're standing in front of the general store with nowhere to go, and it seems like the kind of thing that ought to be said." She thought about it. She thought about Mrs. Calloway's rooming house, and the $2, and the arithmetic she'd already done. "He's hiring?" she said. "I don't know what he'd say if asked directly. Probably no." The sheriff pushed off the post. "But you strike me as a woman who might not ask directly." She walked the 4 miles because she didn't have money for a horse, and she wasn't going to spend what little she had on a cart. The North Road was rutted and steep in places, and the cold had a real edge to it by the time she got past the first mile marker. Her good wool coat did its job mostly. Her feet were a different matter. She didn't let herself think too hard about what she was going to say. Thinking too hard was how you talked yourself out of things, and the things she couldn't afford to be talked out of right now were the ones she most needed to do. The ranch came into view around a bend. A house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, all of it built solid but not fancy. The kind of place that had been put up by someone more interested in it lasting than in it looking a certain way. There was a fence line that needed work. There was a wagon wheel leaning against the side of the barn that had been sitting there long enough to sink slightly into the earth. There was smoke coming from the chimney, which meant someone was home, which meant she hadn't made this walk for nothing. She knocked. The door was opened by a girl of maybe 13 with her mother's cheekbones. Eliza would think this later, she didn't know it then. And a look of complete unwelcoming suspicion that sat on her young face with the ease of long practice. "What do you want?" the girl said. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Ashcroft." "He's not taking visitors." "I'm not a visitor," Eliza said. "I'm looking for work." The girl looked her up and down in a way that was much less cruel than Walter Greer's version of the same thing, but still carried a certain blunt assessment. "Papa doesn't hire women." "He might hire this one," Eliza said. "Would you let him decide?" The girl stared at her for a long second, then turned and hollered into the house without moving from the doorway. "Papa, there's a woman here." There was a silence from somewhere inside, then footsteps. Then Gideon Ashcroft appeared behind his daughter and looked at Eliza through the doorway. He was taller than she'd expected, lean in the way that ranch work made a man lean, not spare, but functional, like every pound on him was there because it had a job to do. His hair was dark and needed cutting. He had hands that looked like they'd been through a war and had mostly won. His face was the hardest thing to read she'd encountered in a while, and she'd dealt with doctors and lawyers and bill collectors in the past year, so that was saying something. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her. "My name is Eliza Harrow," she said. "I came to Ash Hollow today on a personal matter that didn't work out. I have no money and no place to sleep, and winter's coming down off those mountains, and I can see by looking at this place that you've got more work than one man can carry." She held his gaze. "I am not asking for charity. I'm asking for work. I cook, I preserve, I sew. I can manage a household and stretch a food supply further than you'd believe, and I'm stronger than I look." She paused. "In exchange, I'm asking for a roof. 1 meal a day, that's all." Gideon Ashcroft stared at her. "1 meal," he said. His voice was lower than she expected and slower. "1 meal, whatever you can spare." He looked past her at the empty road, then back at her. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Not softness, not pity, something more complicated than either. He looked over his shoulder into the house. Eliza followed his gaze and saw at the kitchen table 3 small faces watching through the doorway. A boy of maybe 10, a girl younger than the one at the door, and a child so small she couldn't tell yet if it was a boy or a girl, all of them thin-faced and wide-eyed and staring. He looked back at Eliza. He stepped back from the door. That was all. He didn't say yes. He didn't say anything. He just stepped back and left a space in the doorway, and Eliza understood that as the only invitation she was going to get. She walked in. The kitchen was cold in the way of rooms that weren't being heated as well as they should be. There was food on the table, or what passed for food, a thin stew of something and bread that had been cut too carefully, the way bread gets cut when there isn't enough of it, and everyone knows it. The 3 children at the table watched her come in with the expressions of people who had learned not to expect much from strangers, but hadn't entirely stopped hoping. The eldest girl, the one who'd opened the door, came in behind Eliza and took her place at the table without a word, her eyes never fully leaving the newcomer. Gideon sat down at the head of the table and picked up his spoon. He said, "Sit." It wasn't warm. It wasn't unwelcoming. It was simply a fact, delivered without decoration, and Eliza sat down in the empty chair at the far end of the table and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the bowl of thin stew that the youngest child had already slid toward her without being asked, with a generosity so instinctive it made Eliza's throat tighten in a way she absolutely refused to show. "That's yours," the small child said. A girl, Eliza saw now, maybe 4, with her father's dark hair and eyes that had the particular brightness of a child who wasn't getting enough sleep. "Thank you," Eliza said. "I'm Rosie," the child said. "I'm Eliza." Rosie considered this with great seriousness. "That's a good name," she said, and went back to her stew. Gideon watched none of this. He ate with the focused efficiency of a man who had learned to think of food as fuel and nothing else. And when he was done, he pushed back his chair and said, without looking at anyone in particular, "There's a room at the back. Marin used it for sewing." He stopped. Something crossed his face fast and was gone. "It's empty now, clean enough." He went out. The back door closed behind him. The 4 children looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at the 4 children. The eldest girl, who Eliza would learn was named Evelyn, said, with the flat directness of someone who had decided suspicion was more honest than politeness, "You're not going to stay." "I intend to," Eliza said. "Everyone says that." Eliza looked at her. "How many people have said it?" Evelyn's jaw tightened slightly. "Enough." Eliza nodded slowly. She picked up her spoon. The stew was thin and needed salt and something, thyme, maybe, or even just a bay leaf. But she ate it without comment because it was what was offered, and she had been raised to be grateful for what was offered, even when it wasn't much. Outside, she could hear Gideon Ashcroft moving around the barn, the sound of a hammer starting up in the cold dark, steady and alone. A man trying to fix things at the end of the day because there were always more things to fix than there was daylight to fix them in, and he hadn't figured out yet that some of the things that were broken in this house couldn't be fixed with a hammer. She ate the stew. She didn't ask for more, though she was hungry enough that her hands weren't quite steady. 1 meal a day. She'd said it and she'd meant it, and she was going to hold to it because her word was the only thing she had left that was entirely hers. Tomorrow she would start working. Tonight she would sleep in the sewing room that had belonged to a woman named Marin, and she would not let herself think too long about that name, or about the way Gideon's face had gone tight when he said it, or about 4 children who watched a stranger sit down at their table with the careful, bruised hope of people who had learned the hard way that hope was a dangerous thing to carry. She would not let herself think about Walter Greer on that platform, or the way his laugh had carried in the cold air, or the way she'd stood there with her spine straight and her face still and her traveling bag in her hand while strangers looked at her. She would not think about any of it. She would eat the stew and sleep in the cold room, and tomorrow she would get up before the children and light the fire, and that was as far ahead as she was going to plan for now. Outside, the hammer kept going, steady, alone. Eliza finished the stew and set down the spoon and looked at Evelyn, who was still watching her with that flat, protective suspicion. "You cook?" Eliza asked. Evelyn's chin came up. "I manage." "I'm sure you do," Eliza said, without a trace of condescension. "Tomorrow morning, if you're willing, I'd like to see what you've got in the larder. We can figure out together what's there and what's needed." Evelyn stared at her. "Together? Unless you'd rather I just handle it myself. I can do that too." It was the right thing to say and the wrong thing to say at the same time, and Eliza knew it the moment she said it. Evelyn's face closed off like a door being quietly shut. "I'll show you the sewing room," Evelyn said, and pushed back her chair. Eliza followed her down the hall, past a door that was closed and had clearly been closed for a long time, past a cracked window someone had stuffed with cloth against the draft, into a small room at the back of the house that held a cold iron stove, a narrow bed with a quilt folded at the foot, and a smell of lavender that was fading but not gone. Evelyn stood in the doorway. "The quilt was my grandmother's," she said, and her voice had something in it that Eliza couldn't quite name. "It stays in the room. It doesn't go anywhere else." "I understand," Eliza said. Evelyn left without saying goodnight. Eliza stood in the small room alone. She put her traveling bag on the floor. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed slowly, in and out, the way she had learned to breathe during the hard years of her mother's illness when there had been nobody to fall apart in front of and no time for it anyway. From somewhere in the house, she could hear Rosie's small voice saying something, asking something, and a boy's voice answering, and then quiet. The hammer outside had stopped. She reached into her bag and took out the only book she'd brought, a thin, battered volume on plant medicine that had been her mother's and had been one of the few things the lawyers hadn't taken. She set it on the floor beside the bed. She didn't open it tonight. She just needed to know it was there. She lay down on the narrow bed under the grandmother's quilt, still in her clothes because the room was cold, and she'd deal with that tomorrow when she knew where things were. And she stared at the ceiling of the sewing room that had belonged to a woman named Marin, who was gone now and had left behind lavender and a quilt and 4 children and a husband who expressed things with a hammer in the dark. Eliza closed her eyes. She was so tired that sleep should have come fast, but it didn't, not quite. It hovered just at the edge while her mind went back one last time to that platform, to Walter's laugh, to the faces of the strangers who had looked, to the sheriff's careful eyes and the way he'd said he's got a pride problem, though he'd call it something else. She thought about Rosie sliding the stew bowl across the table without being asked. She thought about that small instinctive generosity, and something in her chest unlocked just slightly, just enough. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't hope exactly. It was something smaller and more durable than either of those things. Something that felt more like stubbornness dressed up in softer clothes. She had nowhere to go but forward. She slept. She was up before the house woke. That was intentional. Eliza had learned years ago, during the long months of caring for her mother, that the first person awake in any household sets the tone for everything that follows. The temperature of the morning, the pace of the day, the feeling in the air that everyone else breathes in without knowing they're breathing it. She'd wanted to set that tone herself before anyone had a chance to set it for her. The sewing room was dark and cold enough that she could see her own breath, and her back ached from the narrow mattress in the way that backs do when they've spent a night being politely hostile to an unfamiliar surface. She didn't make a fuss about it. She put on her second dress over her first for the warmth, pinned her hair without a mirror — she'd been doing it long enough to manage by feel — and moved into the hallway in her stockinged feet so her boots wouldn't wake the children. The kitchen was worse than the sewing room. The iron stove had gone cold overnight, which meant whoever was supposed to bank the fire before bed either hadn't done it or hadn't known how to do it right. Eliza opened the stove, checked the ash box, found there was wood in the pile beside the back door, and set about building a fire the way her mother had taught her. Small kindling first, patience. Don't rush it or you smother it before it has a chance. While the fire took hold, she looked around the kitchen properly for the first time. In the thin early light, she could see things she hadn't been able to see by lamplight the night before. The shelf above the dry sink held maybe a third of what it should have held at this point in October. There was flour, but not much. A small quantity of dried beans. 3 canning jars, 2 of which appeared to hold some kind of preserves that had been put up hastily, judging by the uneven seal on one lid. A slab of salt pork wrapped in cloth. Some cornmeal. A rope of onions that was mostly onion skins. A single dried apple ring on a hook that someone, probably Rosie, she'd guess, had apparently been saving. Eliza stood and looked at this for a long time without moving. This was not a household running low on provisions. This was a household that was already behind, and winter in the mountains didn't offer grace periods. She heard footsteps and turned to find Gideon standing in the doorway to the hall, fully dressed, watching her look at his shelves. His face was the same impossible thing to read it had been the night before. She couldn't tell if he was embarrassed or defensive or simply blank. "I got up to do that," he said, meaning the fire. "I was awake," she said. He looked at the shelves, then he looked at the floor. "It's been a difficult stretch." "I can see that." He didn't say anything else. He moved to the table and sat down, and after a moment she put water on for coffee. There was coffee at least, though not much. And she made cornmeal mush because there was enough cornmeal, and because mush was filling and required nothing but heat and patience. And she set a bowl in front of him without ceremony, the way you set a bowl in front of someone when food is not about pleasure, but about getting through the morning. He looked at the bowl, then up at her. "You haven't eaten." I'll eat when the children eat. He looked like he wanted to say something about that and then decided not to. He picked up the spoon. Evelyn came in next, already dressed, her hair braided with the tight, competent neatness of a girl who had been doing her own hair since she was 9 or 10. She stopped when she saw Eliza at the stove, and her face went through something fast. Surprise, then the effort to not show the surprise, then that flat watchfulness again. "You made breakfast," Evelyn said. "Cornmeal mush," Eliza said. "It's not much, but it'll hold you." Evelyn said nothing. She set the table with the practiced economy of someone who did this every morning alone, and Eliza noticed she set 5 places. 4 for the children, 1 for her father, and then paused at the 5th chair and looked at Eliza and, after a moment, got a 6th bowl from the shelf. She put it at the end of the table where Eliza had sat the night before. She didn't say anything about it. She just put it there. It was not kindness exactly. It was closer to fairness, which Eliza respected more. The other children came in the order she'd learned was their order, Thomas first, who was 10 and had the cautious, watchful quality of a boy who had been the man of something he was too young to be the man of. Then Clara, who was 7 and had a cold she was trying to ignore. Then Rosie, who came in still half asleep with her hair loose and her feet bare and walked directly to Eliza and tugged on her skirt. "You're still here," Rosie said. "I'm still here," Eliza agreed. Rosie seemed to find this satisfying. She climbed into her chair. Gideon watched all of this over the rim of his coffee cup with the expression of a man watching weather, something happening out there that was neither good nor bad yet, just something to keep an eye on. After breakfast, when Gideon had gone out to the barn and Thomas had followed him in the wordless way that boys follow their fathers into work, Eliza washed the bowls and then turned to Evelyn, who was wiping down the table with the particular thoroughness of a girl who needed something to do with her hands. "You offered to show me the larder," Eliza said. Evelyn looked up. "I didn't offer. You asked. Fair enough? Will you show me?" The larder was off the back of the kitchen, a small cold room that had been built into the north side of the house where it stayed cold longest. What was in it was not enough. Eliza walked the shelves slowly, counting without making it obvious she was counting. And when she was done, she turned around and found Evelyn watching her with her arms crossed over her chest and her chin at the angle that meant she'd already decided to be defensive about whatever came next. "It's not as bad as it looks," Evelyn said. "I know," Eliza said. Evelyn blinked. "You know?" "You've been managing carefully. I can see that. The beans are sorted and the flour's in a sealed tin, which means it won't go stale as fast. You've been doing good work." She paused. "I just think we can do better work together than either of us can do alone." Evelyn stared at her. Something shifted in her face. Not warmth, not yet, nothing that easy. But the angle of her chin came down about 2 degrees. "What would you do differently?" Evelyn said. Not quite a question. "I'd start preserving everything we can still preserve," Eliza said, "before the real cold sets in. There are things growing along the creek line and on the south-facing slopes that most people don't think to use, but they're there and they're free, and I know what to do with them." She watched Evelyn's face. "And I'd ration the salt pork differently. Right now it's being used as a main. It should be a flavoring. A little goes into a pot of beans, makes the whole thing taste like something without using up the pork itself." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Mama used to do it that way," she said. Her voice had gone carefully neutral when she said the word mama, the way voices do when someone has learned to handle a word that still has the ability to cut. "It works," Eliza said simply, and left it there. Because the last thing Evelyn needed was a stranger claiming her mother's methods, and the last thing Eliza was going to do was make this girl feel like she was being replaced in her own kitchen. They went back to the main kitchen, and Eliza started on the noon meal, which was going to be bean soup because it was the most they could make from what they had. Evelyn moved around the kitchen alongside her with the territorial precision of someone deciding how much space to allow an intruder. And Eliza gave her plenty of room and didn't comment on the fact that Evelyn salted the water twice and didn't seem to notice, just quietly adjusted the bean-to-water ratio later to compensate. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway with her cold worse than it had been at breakfast, her small face flushed and miserable. And without being asked, Eliza sent Evelyn to check the sewing room shelf. There was one, she'd noticed last night, above the window, where she'd spotted a small twist of dried something that she hoped was what she thought it was. Evelyn came back with it. "What is this?" "Dried yarrow. Good for a cold and for fever both." Eliza put a pinch in a cup and poured hot water over it. "It's bitter. She'll need honey if there is any." "There isn't." "Then she'll need to be brave," Eliza said. Clara, who had been listening in the doorway, said with the particular dignity of a 7-year-old, "I'm brave." "I know you are," Eliza said, and handed her the cup. Clara drank it with her face screwed up against the bitterness, and then looked up at Eliza with watering eyes. "Is it going to work?" "It usually does," Eliza said. "Usually is the best I can promise." Clara thought about this and seemed to find it acceptable. Evelyn watched all of this from across the kitchen with her arms at her sides now, instead of crossed, which was not the same as open, but was less closed than before. She said, when Clara had gone back to the main room with her cup, "Where did you learn about yarrow?" "My mother knew plants," Eliza said. "She taught me." "Is she—" Evelyn stopped. "She passed in March," Eliza said. Evelyn said nothing for a moment, then, quietly, "My mother passed 2 winters ago." "I know. I'm sorry." Evelyn turned back to the stove. Her shoulders had the particular set of someone holding something in, and Eliza let her hold it, because sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is to just leave them the dignity of their own grief without poking at it. The days found their shape. Eliza was up first every morning, fire first, water on, whatever there was to stretch into a meal. Gideon was up second, out to the barn before the children were awake. Evelyn was up third, and she came into the kitchen each morning with a look that said she hadn't entirely decided about Eliza yet, but was gathering information. Thomas mostly avoided her, which she understood. He was at the age where a strange woman in the house was more confusing than threatening, and he dealt with confusion by going somewhere else. Clara accepted her with the pragmatic openness of a child whose cold had gotten better in 2 days, and who connected that fact directly to the person who'd given her the bitter cup. Rosie had accepted her on day 1, and apparently considered the matter settled. Gideon was the hardest one to read, and she wasn't sure yet if that was because he was naturally closed or because he was specifically closed against her. He didn't give directions, which meant she had to figure out what needed doing by looking, and there was always more than she'd expected. The mending pile was enormous. She found it in a basket in the hall, weeks of torn things that nobody had had time to fix. She worked through it in the evenings when the children were in bed, sitting at the kitchen table by the lamp, sewing until her fingers were clumsy with tiredness, and then stopping, because she only had 1 pair of eyes and they needed to last. On the 5th morning, she found that someone had moved the woodpile closer to the back door. Not a lot closer, just enough to mean she didn't have to go as far in the cold. She didn't mention it, she just noted it. On the 7th morning, Gideon came in for the noon meal and stopped in the doorway and said, "There's a fence line on the east pasture. It's been down a week. I haven't had time." "All right," she said. "Thomas can't manage it alone, and I've got to get the root cellar cleared before the ground freezes. I can help with the fence." He looked at her. "You've done fence work?" "I've done most kinds of work," she said. "Show me what needs doing." He showed her. She did it. It took them 3 hours in the cold, Eliza holding the wire while Gideon drove the staples, neither of them talking much because there wasn't much to say, and the work required attention. At one point, she misjudged the tension on a wire, and it snapped back and caught the back of her hand, and she made a sound. Not quite a word, something sharper. And Gideon grabbed her wrist and looked at the cut with the businesslike efficiency of a man who dealt with injuries as facts. "Come inside," he said. "It's not bad." "Come inside anyway." She let him put a rag on it. He was careful about it, more careful than she expected, his rough hand surprisingly precise as he wrapped the cloth. He didn't say anything the whole time. When he was done, he looked at her hand and then up at her face, and there was something in the look that she couldn't identify and didn't try to. "Thank you," she said. He let go of her hand and went back outside. But the thing about that look stayed with her longer than it should have, and she was irritated at herself for that. Because she wasn't here for that, and she couldn't afford to be here for that, and the last time she had read something into a man's eyes, she had ended up on a train platform in the cold. The trouble with Evelyn started on the 9th day. Eliza had gone to the creek in the early morning, before breakfast, to collect what she'd been planning to collect for days: cattail roots and late-season rose hips, and a particular kind of dried grass that she knew could be ground into a flour substitute. She'd been going in her mind for days, noting what was there, waiting for the right morning when she could get there and back before anyone needed her. She'd mentioned it to no one because she was still new enough that explaining herself felt like a risk she didn't want to take. She came back with her apron full of things and her boots wet and her hair coming loose from the wind off the creek, and she walked into the kitchen to find Evelyn standing at the stove with her arms crossed and a look on her face that was something Eliza hadn't seen before. Not the watchful suspicion of the first days, but something rawer than that. Something that looked more like fear wearing anger's clothes. "Where were you?" Evelyn said. "The creek. I told you last night I was going early." "You didn't tell me." Eliza thought back. She'd said it while Rosie was having her evening cup of warm water and honey. They'd found a small cache of old honeycomb in the back of the larder, and Evelyn had been in the hall, and it was possible she hadn't heard. It was also possible she'd heard and hadn't registered it, and the memory had slipped. "I thought you heard me," Eliza said. "I should have made sure. I'm sorry." Evelyn's jaw was tight. "You just disappeared. Nobody knew where you were. Rosie got up and you weren't here, and She stopped. Her voice had gone unsteady, and she was clearly furious at herself for it. She cried. The weight of that landed. Eliza set down her apron full of plants and creek things and looked at Evelyn straight. "I didn't think about that," she said, and she meant it. "I should have. I will next time." "There doesn't need to be a next time," Evelyn said, and now her voice had the old edge back, the one she'd been carrying since the first night, but Eliza could hear now what was underneath it, and it was not hostility. It was a 13-year-old girl who had spent 2 years being the person everyone else depended on not to disappear, and she had started to depend on Eliza in a way she hadn't decided to and didn't want to and couldn't stop. "Evelyn," Eliza said. "You're going to leave," Evelyn said. "Everyone does. You'll stay until something better comes up, or until Papa can't afford to keep you, or until—" She stopped again and pressed her lips together. "I'm not looking for something better," Eliza said. "I don't have somewhere to go." "That's not the same thing as staying." It wasn't. Eliza knew it wasn't. The girl was right in a way that was hard to argue with. There was a difference between staying because you had nowhere to go and staying because this was where you wanted to be, and she couldn't honestly claim the second one yet. What she could honestly claim was something smaller. "I won't disappear without telling someone where I'm going," she said. "I'll tell you directly, not assume you've heard. That I can promise." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something that was at least open to the future. "Rosie got over it fast," Evelyn said finally, with the slight, rough tone of someone retreating from emotion back to facts. "She was fine by the time Papa came in. I'll apologize to her anyway. She'll like that." Eliza picked up her apron of creek things. "Help me sort these, and I'll show you what each one is." A pause. Then Evelyn uncrossed her arms and moved to the table. Thomas came around slower than anyone else. He was 10 years old, and he had taken on the particular shape of a boy who had decided that feelings were things that happened to other people, and the best protection against them was to keep moving. He helped his father from first light, followed instructions without complaint, ate whatever was put in front of him, went to bed without being told. He didn't speak to Eliza unless he had to, and when he had to, he was polite in the way of someone who had been raised with manners and was going to use them as a wall. The thing that got through to Thomas was not kindness. Kindness he could ignore. What got through was usefulness. He came into the kitchen one afternoon while Eliza was grinding the dried grass she'd collected at the creek, using a flat stone and a wooden bowl because that was what was available. And he watched her work with the wary attention of a boy who wanted to know what she was doing but hadn't decided yet if asking was worth the conversation. She didn't push. She let him watch. After a while, he said, "What is that?" "Wild grass seed. You can grind it fine enough and it cuts the flour." She didn't stop working. Makes the flower go further. He was quiet. Then, Mama used to stretch the flower. Most women in the mountains do, Eliza said. Your mama probably knew things I don't. Different country teaches different things. Thomas was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Less like a wall, more like a door that hadn't been opened in a while but still had a working hinge. He sat down at the table. He didn't offer to help exactly, but he didn't leave. He watched her work for a while and then said, without quite looking at her, she also knew how to fix a harness so it didn't slip. Papa's been using the bad one because neither of us can get it right. Eliza set down the stone. Show me the harness. He looked at her then. You know harnesses? Show me, she said. We'll figure it out together. They figured it out together. It took most of an afternoon and involved Thomas holding things while Eliza worked the leather in ways her hands remembered from a stint she'd done years ago at a cousin's farm in Ohio. And at one point she got it wrong twice in a row and said something under her breath that she immediately wished she hadn't, and Thomas made a sound that was the beginning of a laugh that he caught and converted into a cough, but she heard it. Go ahead, she said. What? Laugh, I earned it. He didn't laugh exactly, but the cough turned into something that had a little more air in it, and when they finally got the harness right and hung it back in the barn, he said, Thanks, in the way that boys say thanks when they mean more than that but don't know how to say the more. She didn't make a big thing of it. Making a big thing of it would have ruined it. The first real blow came in the third week. The sheriff, his name was Holloway, she'd learned, came up the road on a gray afternoon when the sky was the color of pewter and the air smelled like the snow that hadn't fallen yet. Eliza was in the yard collecting the last of the dried herb bundles she'd hung on the south fence, and she saw him coming and felt something drop in her stomach before she knew why. He drew up his horse and looked at her with that careful face of his. Miss Harrow. Sheriff. I wanted to check in, he said. See how you're settling. Fine, thank you. He nodded, but he had the look of a man who had come to say something specific and was deciding how to begin. I ran into Walter Greer in town, he said. He's been asking questions about the Ashcroft place. Eliza's hand stilled on the herb bundle. What kind of questions? The curious kind. About whether Gideon had taken on a housekeeper. About who you were. She looked at him steadily. And what did you tell him? Nothing of use, Holloway said. But I thought you should know. He's a man who doesn't like being made to look foolish, and he's decided he looked foolish that day at the station. He made himself look foolish, Eliza said. I was the one standing there. I know that, Holloway said. I'm not defending him. I'm just telling you. He tipped his hat and rode back down the road. Eliza stood in the yard with the herb bundle in her hands and looked after him until the cold pushed her back inside. She didn't tell Gideon that night. She wasn't sure what she would have said anyway, that the man who abandoned her was asking about where she was. What was Gideon supposed to do with that? She filed it in the back of her mind where she kept things she needed to watch without watching too hard. And she went back to work. What she couldn't stop, though, was the way it changed something in her chest. Walter Greer asking about her meant Walter Greer was aware of her, and that awareness felt like a shadow over a day that had otherwise been plain enough. She didn't want his attention. She'd spent one afternoon on that platform completely destroyed by his attention, and now here he was, circling back the way bad things had a way of circling back when you just started to feel the ground under your feet. That evening, Gideon came in late for supper, later than usual, and sat down at the table with the particular heaviness of a man who had spent his day fighting something and wasn't sure if he'd won. The children ate and went to bed, and Eliza cleared the table, and when she turned around, Gideon was still sitting there, which was unusual because he was always the first one up and out. Do you know anything about frostbite in cattle? He said, without preamble. She turned. Some. Why? Lost 2 calves last winter. Not to cold directly. To the infection after. Didn't know what I was looking at in time. He looked at the table. We've got a late calf this year. Should have been born in summer. It's not going to do well in the first hard freeze. Watch the ears and tail for the first signs, she said. Any white or gray at the tips? You've got to get them inside immediately, even if they fight it. Hay packed around them, as much body heat as you can get on them. Dried comfrey on any open skin. Reduces the damage. He looked up at her. Comfrey. I collected some along the creek. I dried it. It's in the sewing room. He was quiet for a moment, then, "You've been doing that, collecting, storing?" "Yes." "I've seen the shelf in the sewing room filling up. Didn't know what half of it was." "I should have explained," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd want to know." He frowned. "Why wouldn't I want to know what's in my house?" "Because I didn't want you to think I was claiming something that wasn't mine to claim," she said. "I'm here on your goodwill. I don't want to overstep." Gideon looked at her for a long moment with that expression she still couldn't fully read. Then he said, quiet and careful, like someone laying down a thing they'd been carrying at an angle that hurt, "You haven't overstepped." The room was very quiet. The fire made its soft, shifting sounds. "All right," she said. "The children." He stopped, started again. "They're different since you came." He seemed to find this difficult to say, like he was describing something in a language he was still learning. Better. Eliza didn't say anything. She waited. "Rosie laughed this morning," he said. "Really laughed. She hasn't done that since—" He stopped again, pressed his mouth into a line. "In a long time." The fire shifted. Something cracked in the wood. "She's a bright child," Eliza said carefully. "She is," he said. He pushed back his chair and stood, and the moment closed the way moments do, not finished exactly, but sealed, put away. "Good night, Miss Harrow." "Good night, Mr. Ashcroft." He went down the hall. She heard his door. She stood in the kitchen alone for a while, not doing anything in particular, just standing in the warmth of the fire and letting the day sit on her properly. The herb bundles, the harness, the comfrey shelf in the sewing room, the look on Evelyn's face when she'd finally uncrossed her arms. All of it still fragile. All of it still possible to lose. She went to the sewing room and sat on the edge of the bed and opened her mother's plant book and checked the list she'd been keeping in the back, what she'd collected, what she'd dried, what was stored, and where. The list was longer than she expected when she saw it written out, longer than she'd realized. She thought about the sky that afternoon, the pewter color of it, the way it had smelled. Snow was coming. Not tonight, maybe not this week, but soon. She could feel it the way she could always feel things that were coming before they arrived. Not prescience, just the particular attentiveness of someone who had spent her life having to see things early because no one else was going to see them for her. She turned to a fresh page in the back of the book and began a new list. What they still needed. What she still had to collect. What would not survive the first hard freeze and had to be gathered before then. The page filled faster than she liked. She kept writing. The snow came on a Tuesday. Not the gentle first snow that the mountains sometimes offered in November, the kind that dusted the fence posts and melted by noon and let people pretend winter was still at a polite distance. This was the other kind, the kind that arrived without a proper warning, that came down out of a sky that had been gray for 3 days and showed no sign of stopping. And by the time Eliza woke at 4 in the morning and heard the silence that meant serious accumulation, there was already 8 inches on the ground and more coming. She lay still for a moment in the dark of the sewing room, listening. Snow silence had a particular quality. It wasn't the absence of sound so much as the absorption of it, the way thick snow swallowed the sounds that normally traveled across a ranch yard. She couldn't hear the horses. She couldn't hear the wind. She could hear her own breathing and the faint creak of the house settling under weight. She was dressed and in the kitchen before she'd fully decided to be. The fire was already going. Gideon was at the table in his coat with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring at the window where the dark outside was broken only by the white accumulation on the sill. He looked like a man who had been sitting there for a while already, thinking the kind of thoughts that didn't have good answers. He heard her come in and didn't turn. "It's bad," he said. "How much?" "1.5 feet by the barn, still coming." He finally looked at her. "The root cellar cover's holding, but the weight's going to be a problem by tomorrow if it doesn't stop." "The late calf?" "Brought it in last night when the sky went wrong. It's in the barn with the others." He set down his cup. "The road to town's going to be impassable by mid-morning." Eliza moved to the stove and put more wood on without thinking about it. "How long do you think it holds?" "Looking at that sky." He shook his head. "Week. Maybe more." She turned to look at him directly. "That's all right," she said. He looked back at her. "Eliza, We've got maybe 3 weeks of provisions by my count. If the road's out for a week and we lose another week to drift and ice after, we're short." He hadn't called her by her name before. She noticed it and let it go without showing that she noticed it. "By your count," she said. "What does that mean?" She sat down across from him. Outside, the snow kept falling into the silence it was making. She'd been thinking for weeks about how to say this. How to explain what she'd been doing in the sewing room at night, on the creek bank in the early mornings, along the south-facing slope where she'd gone 3 times in November with her apron and her collecting bag without telling anyone where she was going except Evelyn, who had started coming with her. She'd been thinking about how to say it in a way that didn't sound like she was making a claim she wasn't entitled to make, or pointing out what he should have seen himself, or presenting herself as something she wasn't. In the end, she said it the way she said most things that mattered. Plain. "There's more than your count," she said. "Come look." She took him to the sewing room. She hadn't let anyone in here except Evelyn. Not because she was hiding things, she'd been transparent enough about the collecting, about the drying, about the grinding, but because seeing the whole of it laid out would have required explanations she hadn't been ready to give yet, and she'd told herself she'd explain when it was needed. It was needed now. She lit the lamp and held it up and let him look. The shelves she'd put up herself 2 weeks ago, using boards from the scrap pile beside the barn, and the tools she'd borrowed without asking because she'd assumed it was easier to beg forgiveness than permission, and Gideon had never said anything about the boards being gone. The shelves held what she'd spent the past 5 weeks accumulating, dried roots wrapped in cloth and labeled in her small, precise handwriting, rose hip powder in 3 sealed jars, rendered fat in 4 wide-mouthed tins she'd found in the back of the larder and cleaned, dried cattail pollen, which could be mixed into flour and added nutrition, 3 kinds of dried mushroom, the ones she'd been certain of, and only those, comfrey and yarrow, and the dried grass seed she'd told Thomas about, 2 crocks of pickled wild garlic, a carefully sealed bottle of rose hip syrup for Clara's colds, dried apple strips, not the 1 ring that had been hanging in the kitchen, but 2 dozen that she'd done herself from the half-barrel of seconds she'd found in the back of the barn, going soft, cut thin, and dried on the sewing room sill in the afternoon sun for 10 days. On the floor, a sack of dried beans she'd sorted and cleaned, a second sack of mixed grain, a crock of rendered tallow for the lamps in case the regular oil ran low. Gideon stood in the doorway of the sewing room and looked at all of it for a long time. He didn't say anything. "The apples were going soft," Eliza said. "They wouldn't have lasted another 2 weeks. I should have asked before I used them. I didn't." He still didn't say anything. "The fat is from the bones of the November slaughter," she said. "Normally it would go to waste. There's enough there for 6 weeks of cooking if we're careful. Plus it keeps the lamps going." "Eliza." His voice was strange. She couldn't read it. "The mushrooms I was careful about. Only 3 kinds that I can identify without any doubt. I didn't risk—" "Eliza." Louder this time, but not angry. He turned and looked at her, and his face was doing something complicated that she didn't know what to do with. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since the 3rd week," she said, "when I looked at the larder and did the arithmetic." "The 3rd week," he repeated, like he was measuring it against something. "In November. You started in October." "Yes. You've been preparing for this since before it happened." "I thought it might happen. This kind of sky, this kind of mountain, it usually does." She kept her voice even. "I wasn't certain. I just thought it would be foolish not to be ready in case." He turned back to look at the shelves, and she couldn't see his face. His hand came up and touched one of the labeled jars, rose hip powder, and then dropped. "What does this give us?" he said. His voice was low. "How long?" Eliza thought through what she'd stored, what was in the larder, what was in the root cellar, what they could stretch and how. She'd done this calculation in her head more times than she could count, adjusting it as she'd added to the shelves, checking it against her mother's plant book and her own memory. 10 weeks, she said. Maybe 11 if the children don't grow a full inch. She said the last part without quite meaning to, and it landed somewhere between dark and something almost like humor. Gideon turned around. His eyes were bright in a way she wasn't prepared for. Not wet, not quite, but close to it. and the effort to not be close to it was visible on his face, which was usually so controlled that seeing anything through it was startling. 11 weeks, he said. Close enough to spring. He looked at her. He looked at the shelves. He looked back at her. Nobody else in this valley has done this, he said. I've been ranching for 15 years and I haven't done this. You've been doing everything else, she said. You can't do everything. He didn't answer that. He stood in her doorway, the doorway of the sewing room that had been his wife's, and she watched him put something back in place behind his face, some wall that he needed, and she wasn't going to be the one to argue him out of. I'll go check the root cellar cover, he said. Take Thomas. The weight needs 2 people to shift safely. He nodded and went down the hall, and she heard him knock on Thomas's door, and she stood in the lamplight of the sewing room alone for a moment, looking at her shelves. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for it alone, without being asked, without being thanked in advance, in a house where she was allowed 1 meal a day and a cold room to sleep in. And she had done it because it needed to be done, and because she could see that it needed to be done, and because that was what she did. It was what she had always done. It was the one thing she had that Walter Greer, with all his public laughter, could not take from her. The particular unglamorous ability to look at what was coming and start working before anyone else had decided to look. She put out the lamp and went back to the kitchen to start breakfast. The storm held for 9 days. On day 3, Clara's cold came back worse than before, and Eliza gave her the rose hip syrup in careful small doses and made her sleep on the kitchen side of the house where the stove kept the air warmer. And she sat with her the first night because Clara was frightened in the particular wordless way of sick children, and Eliza held her hand and told her a story she made up as she went about a horse that could read, which was not a good story by any measure, but it was long and it kept going, and Clara fell asleep somewhere in the middle of chapter 2. Evelyn came to the kitchen doorway at midnight, wrapped in a blanket, and found Eliza still sitting by Clara's cot. I can sit with her, Evelyn said. I'm awake anyway. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe. She was quiet for a long moment, watching Clara sleep. Then she said without looking at Eliza, She likes you more than she likes me. Eliza looked up. That's not true. It is a little. Evelyn's voice was flat, just stating a thing. Clara always liked strangers better than family, even when Mama was alive. She paused. It used to make Mama laugh. Eliza said nothing. She waited, because she'd learned that Evelyn talked about her mother the way you talked about something you'd learned to carry carefully, in small pieces, when the weight of a full piece was too much. Mama would have liked you, Evelyn said. She said it the way you say things you've decided to say after arguing with yourself about them for a while. I've been thinking that for a few weeks. I didn't want to say it because it felt... She stopped. Like a betrayal, Eliza said quietly. Evelyn looked at her. Yes. It's not, Eliza said. That's not how that works. Evelyn looked back at Clara. I know that. I know it up here. She touched her temple. Here is slower. She touched her chest. Eliza nodded. She understood this more than she had any business saying. I'm not trying to replace her, Eliza said. I want you to know that. I'm not trying to be anything other than useful to all of you. I know, Evelyn said. And then, so quietly, it might have been something else. I'm glad you're here. She went back to bed without waiting for a response, which was the most Evelyn thing she could have done. And Eliza sat in the warm kitchen with the sleeping child and felt the sentence settle into her chest, like something she hadn't known she was waiting for. On day 5 of the storm, Walter Greer came to the ranch. Eliza heard the horse before anyone else did. She'd been in the yard, clearing the path from the back door to the root cellar cover for the 3rd time that day, and she heard hooves crunching through packed snow and looked up to see a horse and rider coming through the white from the direction of town, which meant the road wasn't as fully impassable as they'd thought, or he'd push through it anyway. She recognized him before he was fully in the yard. The set of his shoulders, the particular way he sat a horse, upright in a way that was more about looking upright than about actual comfort in the saddle. Walter Greer, who had laughed at her on a platform 6 weeks ago, rode into the yard of the Ashcroft Ranch and stopped his horse 10 feet from where she stood with a snow shovel in her hands. He looked at her for a moment, then he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that worked better at a distance. "Eliza," he said. She didn't say anything. "You're looking well," he said. She still didn't say anything. She stood with the shovel and looked at him and waited to see what he thought he was doing here. He swung down from the horse, carefully, because the snow was uncertain footing and he didn't want to fall in front of her. She could see him thinking about this, and took off his hat. "I've been thinking," he said, "that I acted poorly. At the station." "You did," she said. He blinked slightly. He'd expected more resistance or more softness. She could tell he'd prepared for either, and she wasn't giving him either. "I'd like to talk, if you'll let me." "I'm working," she said. "It won't take long." She heard the back door and looked over to see Gideon standing on the step. He hadn't put a coat on, just stood there in his shirt in the cold, looking at the yard. His eyes went from Eliza to Walter Greer and back to Eliza with the flat attention of a man cataloging something. Walter turned to look at him too. "Ashcroft," he said, with the performed ease of a man who'd decided he was in a strong position and hadn't checked yet. Gideon didn't respond to his name. He looked at Eliza. "You need help?" "I'm fine," she said. He stayed on the step. He didn't go back inside. Walter turned back to Eliza and lowered his voice, which was pointless given the stillness of a snow-muffled yard where sound carried perfectly. "I made a mistake," he said. "A significant one. I reacted badly, and I said things in public that were beneath me. And I've thought about it since, and I'd like to make it right." "How?" Eliza said. He looked slightly wrong-footed by the directness. "I'm still looking for a wife," he said. "What I said at the station, I was caught off guard, and I behaved badly. But the offer I made you in those letters still stands." The yard was very quiet. Eliza became aware that she was standing in snow past her ankle, that her hands were cold on the shovel handle, that somewhere in the barn the late calf was alive because she'd known to look for gray at the ears and tail, and she had the comfrey on the shelf, and she'd been ready. She became aware of Evelyn's face at the kitchen window, watching. She became aware of Gideon on the step, still there, not going anywhere. She looked at Walter Greer. She looked at him the way she hadn't been able to look at him on the platform, when his laugh had landed on her and she'd had to stand straight and hold her face still and not let him see the damage. She looked at him now from the other side of that day, from 6 weeks of cold mornings and fence wire and harness leather and yarrow tea and a child's hand in the dark. "No," she said. He stared. "I'm offering you—" "I heard what you offered. No. Eliza, you're working as a ranch hand in a house that—" "Mr. Greer." Her voice was level and clear in the cold air. "You made your opinion of me plain in front of a station full of people. I'm not interested in what's changed your mind since then, because nothing you've changed your mind about has anything to do with me." She looked at him steadily. "You should go back to town. The road's uncertain, and it'll be dark early." Walter Greer looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was tight. He was a man who had expected a different outcome and didn't know what to do with this one. He looked at Gideon on the step. Whatever he was looking for there, he didn't find it. Gideon looked back at him with the patience of a man who had all day and was not cold. Walter put his hat back on and got back on his horse. He turned the animal without a word and rode back out of the yard, and Eliza watched him go and felt nothing as dramatic as satisfaction. Something quieter, more like the feeling of setting down something heavy after you've carried it long enough. She picked up the shovel and went back to work on the path. Gideon came down from the step into the snow in his stockinged feet, which she thought was practical insanity. "Who was that?" he said, though she suspected he'd already worked it out. "Someone I knew before I came here," she said. "He's gone." He looked at the tire tracks the horse had left in the snow. He looked at her. He went back inside without pushing further, and she was grateful for that, because she didn't have a longer answer than the one she'd given, and she didn't want to have to construct one. By day 7, the mood in the house had shifted into something she couldn't have predicted from the outside. It should have been harder. 9 people in a snowed-in house on rationed provisions, no road to town. The the cold pressing in through every gap in the siding. It should have been tense, fractious, the kind of claustrophobic misery that made families remember every grievance they'd ever had with each other. What it actually was something she didn't have a clean word for. The children, cut off from school and outdoor roaming, had reorganized themselves around the kitchen table in the evenings. Thomas had discovered that Eliza could play checkers and was genuinely competitive at it, which had apparently surprised him enough to make him view her differently. Rosie had designated herself Eliza's shadow with such wholehearted commitment that Eliza sometimes had to ask her to please sit still for 5 minutes so she could peel something. Clara had mostly recovered and had appointed herself the keeper of the lamp in the evenings, which meant she refilled and trimmed it with great ceremony every night, and acted as though the light itself was her personal contribution. Evelyn sat with Eliza after the younger children were in bed. It had become a thing that happened without either of them deciding it should. The house would go quiet, and they'd be at the table with the lamp between them, Eliza mending or grinding or noting things in her plant book, Evelyn doing her schoolwork, or occasionally doing nothing, just sitting. They talked sometimes. They didn't talk sometimes. Both were acceptable. One night Evelyn said, out of nowhere, "Papa looked at the sewing room shelves again today." Eliza kept her eyes on the mending. "Did he?" "He was in there for a while. I didn't say anything." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "He's not good at saying things," she said. "He wasn't even before Mama died. After, it got worse." She turned a page in her book without reading it. "He used to talk more. He used to tell stories at supper. He stopped." Eliza kept sewing. She didn't say anything because she could feel that Evelyn wasn't finished. "He looks at you differently than he looks at other people," Evelyn said. Eliza's needle paused for a fraction of a second. "What do you mean?" "I don't know exactly, like he's paying attention." Evelyn shrugged with the deliberate casualness of a 13-year-old who was paying very close attention to what she was pretending not to care about. "He doesn't really pay attention to most things that aren't the ranch." "He pays attention to you children," Eliza said. "He worries about us. That's different from paying attention." Evelyn turned another unread page. "I'm just saying what I noticed." Eliza went back to her mending. Her hands were steady. Her chest was less steady, which she declined to do anything about except note it and put it in the same place she'd put the other things she wasn't dealing with yet. On the 9th day, the snow stopped. It stopped between midnight and 4 in the morning, and when Eliza woke at her usual hour and went to the kitchen, the quality of the silence had changed. The absorbing heaviness of active snowfall had lifted, replaced by the crystalline, absolute quiet of a mountain after a storm. The kind of quiet that meant clear sky and cold that could take the top of your lungs off if you breathed it too fast. Gideon was already at the window. "It stopped," she said. "Hour ago, maybe." He was looking out at the yard, which was white and sharp and still. "Road'll be solid ice now, 2-3 days before anyone gets through." "That's all right," she said. He turned to look at her. "We're going to make it through," he said. Not a question, not quite a statement either. It was something between the two, the kind of thing you say when the reality of a thing is finally landing properly after days of uncertainty. "Yes," she said. "We are." He looked at her for a moment in the lamplight. He had a week and a half of rough beard and eyes that were tired but no longer carrying the same weight they'd carried the morning the storm started. He looked like a man who had come through something and was just beginning to understand what it would have looked like if he hadn't. "I need to say something," he said. "You don't have to," she said. "I do." He looked at the window again, then back at her. "I brought you here because I was desperate and too proud to say it. And you made it easy not to have to say it. And I didn't look after you properly." His jaw was tight. "1 meal a day. You said it, and I agreed to it. And I didn't think hard enough about what that meant or why you'd say it." Eliza said nothing. "You weren't eating enough," he said. "I saw it, but I didn't say anything because—" He stopped. "I don't have a good reason. I was keeping my head down the way I do." "Gideon," she said. "I'm saying it wrong," he said, which was possibly the most honest thing she'd heard him say. "You're saying it fine," she said. "And you've been fair to me, more than fair. You gave me a roof, and you gave me work, and you didn't make it harder than it needed to be." She looked at him plainly. That matters. It mattered a great deal when I came here. He looked like he wanted to say something else and didn't know how. The lamp between them made the kitchen warm, and the window behind him showed the white and the dark outside. You'll eat properly, he said finally. From now, same as everyone else. All right, she said. Not one meal, 3. All right. He looked at her for a moment more. Then he turned and went back to the stove, and she got down the cornmeal, and they made breakfast in the warm kitchen together in the early dark, while the mountain held its post-storm silence outside, and the cold sat blue and absolute over everything, and all 4 children were asleep and dreaming. Sometime around the 6th morning of the storm, Thomas had done a thing that she hadn't expected. She'd been at the root cellar doing the daily count, tallying what they'd used against what remained. The arithmetic she ran every morning to make sure her 11-week estimate was holding. And when she came back to the kitchen, Thomas was standing at the shelf she'd set up inside the kitchen door, the one where she kept the daily use supplies. He was looking at a jar. She'd expected him to put it down and move away the way he usually did when she caught him close to something he was curious about. Instead, he said, "How do you know how much to use every day?" She told him. She explained the calculation, what they had totaled divided by how many weeks until the roads were reliably open, divided again by the number of people and their relative needs. She explained the adjustment factor for unexpected things, a child getting sick and needing more, the stove burning hotter on cold days and needing more wood, which meant less time for the fire to go cold at night, which actually saved fuel overall. Thomas listened with his entire body, the way he listened when Gideon explained ranch things, like it was going into a place where useful things were stored. When she was done, he said, "Can I do it tomorrow?" She'd looked at him. "The count?" "Yeah." "Do you want to practice today first?" They'd practiced today, and tomorrow he'd done the count himself, showing her his numbers after, which were accurate to within a small error that was actually her error because she'd miscounted the bean sack by a ½ pound. She'd told him that, and he'd looked at the numbers and found where she'd gone wrong and pointed to it with his finger and said nothing, just pointed, and she'd said, "You're right." And he'd put the ledger page on the shelf with the careful satisfaction of a boy learning something he intended to know for the rest of his life. This was what the storm had given them, underneath all the difficulty. 9 days of being stuck with each other until the stuckness became something else, something that didn't have a clean name but felt, in the evenings by the lamp, in the mornings by the stove, like the thing that happened when enough time passed and enough truth got told and enough small dailiness accumulated that a group of people became less like strangers sharing a roof and more like something that held together from the inside. She still didn't let herself call it what it was starting to feel like. That felt like something she had to earn still, or wait for, or something. She wasn't sure of the rules, and she'd stopped trusting herself to read the rules of situations where she wanted the outcome. But on the 9th morning, when the snow stopped and the sky came clear, and Gideon stood in the kitchen and said the words she'd been working toward since October, what she felt under her breastbone was not triumph and not relief exactly. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. She had looked at what was coming, and she had started working. And here they were on the other side of it, all 6 of them, intact. The root cellar cover held, the late calf survived, the lamp oil lasted, the bean sack, even with Thomas's slight miscalculation, was going to stretch to February. Everything she had gathered in the dark of the early mornings, everything she had dried and sealed and labeled in her small, precise handwriting in the cold of the sewing room, all of it had added up, the way small, careful things add up when someone is paying attention long enough. Outside, the mountain was white and silent and cold. Inside, the fire was going, and the cornmeal was on the stove, and Rosie's voice could be heard from the back of the house, already awake, already coming. Rosie's voice reached the kitchen before she did, the way it always did. She was singing something she'd invented herself, a shapeless, wandering melody with words that made no particular sense but had a kind of internal logic that only Rosie understood, something about a brown horse and a jar of honey and someone named Edith, who may or may not have been real. Eliza had stopped trying to follow the narrative of Rosie's songs 3 weeks ago and had simply started accepting them as weather, as background, as the particular sound that meant the day was beginning in a way that was, against all the odds of the past winter, ordinary. Ordinary was something Eliza had not expected to find here. She'd expected to work hard. She'd expected coldness, difficulty, the particular friction of being unwanted in a place where she'd had to insert herself out of desperation. She'd expected to earn every inch of ground. What she had not expected was that ordinary would arrive so quietly, so without announcement, that she wouldn't notice it happening until it had already happened. The road to town had cleared by the third day after the snow stopped, the way Gideon had predicted, and life on the ranch had moved back into its rhythms with the ease of something that had found its shape. But the rhythms were different now than they'd been before the storm, and everyone knew it without saying it. The storm had compressed them. 9 days of close quarters and rationed food and Clara's fever and Thomas's daily counts, and Evelyn sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings had done something to the space between them that couldn't be undone by the snow melting. February arrived gray and cold, but manageable. The provisions held exactly as Eliza had calculated, within a half-week's margin, which she considered acceptable given that she'd had no previous experience with this specific mountain, this specific winter, these specific 6 people, and how much they ate when they were frightened versus how much they ate when they weren't. The bean sack outlasted Thomas's estimate and her own. The rose hip syrup got Clara through 2 more short colds without either of them becoming the longer kind. The rendered fat stretched so far that by the time the general store road opened properly in late January, and Gideon could have bought more lamp oil, they didn't need to. He bought it anyway. He came back from town with lamp oil and a length of blue wool cloth and set both on the kitchen table without comment. The cloth was the approximate color of the bolt she'd seen in the general store window the day she arrived in Ash Hollow. She didn't think he'd been in that store on that day, but she also didn't think the color was a coincidence, and she didn't ask because some things were better as what they were than as what they became when you put words on them. She made Clara a dress from the cloth. Clara wore it for 4 days straight before Evelyn made her take it off to wash it. The shifts in the house were small and accumulated. Thomas began leaving space for Eliza in conversations with his father. Not pushing her in, just leaving a gap where her opinion could go if she wanted to put it there. Gideon began occasionally putting it there directly. What would you do with the east pasture come spring? Or, Eliza, you know that plant along the creek with the red stem? Not as tests, but as genuine questions, the kind you ask someone whose answer you've decided to take seriously. Rosie had long ago moved past the question of whether Eliza belonged here and was now in the phase of assuming Eliza's permanent presence in all future planning, including plans Eliza was fairly certain were not going to happen, such as Rosie's stated intention to build a house for the brown horse next to the sewing room window. Evelyn was the most changed, and the change was the most careful to look at directly, because looking at it too directly felt like it might disturb it. She had stopped crossing her arms when she talked to Eliza somewhere around the second week of January. Eliza had noticed and not noted it aloud, and it had stayed uncrossed. She had started asking questions that weren't challenges, not why would you do it that way with the emphasis on the why, but how do you know which mushrooms are safe with the emphasis on how, the real curiosity of a girl who had been managing a household since she was 11 and wanted more tools. She had, 3 weeks ago, asked Eliza to show her the plant book. They had spent an entire Sunday afternoon with it spread on the kitchen table between them, Evelyn asking questions and Eliza answering and occasionally saying, I don't know, because she didn't know everything in the book. Her mother had known more, and saying I don't know was the only honest answer, and Evelyn seemed to respect it specifically because it was honest. At the end of that afternoon, Evelyn had said quietly, Can I copy some of this? Into my own book? Of course, Eliza said. I'll use it right, Evelyn said, and the way she said it, not as a question, not as a promise exactly, but as a statement of her own intention and character, made Eliza's throat tighten in a way she managed not to show. I know you will, she said. The thing with Gideon was harder to name, and she was less sure what to do with it. He was not a man who said things. She had understood this about him from the first night, and she had adjusted accordingly because she'd grown up around her father before he left and her uncle after, and she knew the kind of man who communicated in presence and absence rather than words, and she had learned to read that language even when she found it frustrating. Gideon's version of saying something was to do something, to put lamp oil on the table, to fix the hinge on the sewing room door that had been sticking since October without being asked or mentioning he'd done it, to make sure there was coffee before she came into the kitchen, because he'd noticed she needed the coffee first, before anything else, and he'd simply started making enough for two. She noticed all of it. She was careful not to make it mean more than it was, because she was careful in general about that kind of thing, and because this family had a dead woman at its center who was still very much present in the closed door down the hall, and the quilt on the sewing room bed, and the recipe box on the kitchen shelf that nobody touched. Marin. She had a full name by now, Marin Ashcroft, born Marin Lotta. Brant, who had come from Minnesota at 19 to marry a man she'd met twice, who had made this house into something warm before the cold got into her lungs in the winter 2 years ago and took her in 6 weeks. Eliza knew this because Evelyn had told her, piece by piece over the months, in the careful way Evelyn did most things, deliberately, with control, not letting go of more than she'd decided to let go of. She knew Marin had been a strong woman. She knew Marin had laughed loudly, which apparently embarrassed Gideon in public and delighted him in private. She knew Marin had kept a kitchen garden that had mostly failed in the Rocky Mountain soil, but that she'd tended every year anyway because she was from Minnesota, where things grew, and she refused to believe Colorado was entirely different. She knew Marin had written her recipes down in a book with a red cover that sat on the kitchen shelf and that nobody had opened since she died. Eliza had never touched the book. She'd worked around it for 4 months as though it were a particular kind of silence that deserved to be kept. The offer came on a Thursday in late February, on a morning when the light had that particular quality that meant the worst of winter was over, even if you couldn't prove it yet. Thinner cold, less weight to the air, the horses in the pasture standing differently. Sheriff Holloway came up the road mid-morning and knocked at the front door, which nobody used, and Eliza went around from the side yard where she'd been working and found him on the front step looking slightly uncomfortable at having knocked on the wrong door. "Miss Harrow," he said. He had a piece of paper in his hand. "Sheriff?" She looked at the paper. He held it out. "This came through the land office for you. I offered to bring it up." It was a letter. She didn't recognize the handwriting on the outside. She opened it there on the front step in the thin February cold and read it while Holloway looked at the fence line with careful neutrality. It was from a Mrs. Doris Pell of the Pell household and domestic agency in Denver. It said that Mrs. Pell had heard, through a series of connections the letter described briefly, of a Miss Eliza Harrow currently residing in the Ash Hollow area with considerable experience in household management, plant medicine, and provisions organization. It said that Mrs. Pell was looking for a household manager for a prominent Denver family. Not a servant position, the letter specified clearly, but a managerial one, with full authority over the household staff and provisions budget. It said the salary would be $42 a month with room, board, and 2 Sundays off. $42 a month. Eliza stood on the front step and held the letter, and did the arithmetic with the distant, slightly unreal clarity of someone reading a number they hadn't expected to see. $42 a month was more than she'd made in any previous year of her life. It was independence. It was the ability to save money and never again stand on a train platform with $2.14 and no plan. "Good news?" Holloway said, with the tone of a man who already suspected the answer was complicated. "Possibly," she said. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and thanked him, and he rode back down the road, and she stood in the thin cold for a moment before going back inside. She didn't tell anyone that day. She wasn't sure why, except that she needed to hold it by herself for a while first, the way you needed to hold something heavy with both hands before you figured out what to do with it. She made the noon meal. She washed the dishes. She sat with Rosie in the afternoon while Rosie dictated a letter to the brown horse that she wanted Eliza to write down, because Rosie's letters were still more enthusiasm than legibility. She made supper. She sat at the table in the evening while Evelyn did her schoolwork and Thomas read a farming almanac that was 2 years out of date but that he'd found in the barn and treated as essential reference material. The letter sat in her apron pocket the whole time like a coal that hadn't quite caught. She told Gideon after supper, after the children were in bed, not because she'd decided to, exactly, but because he came into the kitchen for his late cup of coffee and sat down and looked at her with the look that meant he'd noticed she was carrying something, and she'd found that she didn't particularly want to carry it in front of him without acknowledging it. She took the letter out and put it on the table. He read it. He read it slowly, the way he read everything, like the words needed to be fully processed before the next one was allowed in. He set it down. He was quiet for long enough that the fire shifted twice. "Denver," he said. "Yes." "42 a month." "Yes." He looked at the letter, and then at his coffee, and then at neither, at some middle distance that she recognized as where he went when he was working something out that mattered to him. "That's a fair offer," he said. "It is." "Good position." His voice was careful, controlled in the way of something being held carefully. "Management, not service. That's—" He stopped. "It would be security," she said, "the kind I've never had." He nodded once, tight. He picked up his coffee cup. She watched him. She watched him not say what she thought he might be near to saying, and she understood why he wasn't saying it. And she also understood that if he didn't say something soon, she was going to have to make this decision without knowing something important. And making decisions without knowing important things was how she'd ended up on a train platform in October. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" She kept her voice level. Not a push, not a demand, just a direct question from someone who needed a direct answer and was no longer afraid to ask for one. He set the coffee cup down. He looked at his hands on the table. He said, in the voice of a man who had been constructing this sentence for a long time and was still not sure he had it right, "I'm thinking that you've kept this family alive this winter and that I didn't earn that, and that if you go to Denver, it's no more than what you deserve, and I don't have the right to ask you to stay." "You could ask," she said. "You just don't have the right to expect." He looked up at her. The lamp was between them. His face had the particular vulnerability of a man whose control had slipped just enough to show what was underneath. And what was underneath was not weakness exactly, but something that had been under considerable pressure for a long time. "You're not a ranch hand," he said. It sounded like it had been sitting in him for a while. "I brought you here and put you in the sewing room and told you 1 meal a day, and that—" He stopped, jaw tight. "That's not how I'd have done it if I'd been thinking clearly." "You were desperate," she said. "I was desperate. We were both doing what we had to." "I've been trying to figure out," he said slowly, "how to say that you don't have to keep being desperate. Here, with us." He looked at the table again. "I'm not saying it right." "You're saying it all right," she said. "The children—" He stopped again. "I know about the children," she said quietly. "I know what leaving would mean for them. I'm not going to pretend I don't." She looked at him carefully. "But I need to know what it would mean for you. Not for the ranch, not for the provisions management, for you." The kitchen was very quiet. Gideon looked at her for a long time with the expression of a man who was arriving somewhere he'd been walking toward for months without admitting it was a destination. "It would mean losing something I didn't know I still had," he said. The words sat on the table between them like something irreversible. Eliza looked at the letter. She looked at Gideon. She thought about $42 a month and independence and the kind of security she'd never had. She thought about Denver, which she'd never seen, and Mrs. Pell, whom she didn't know, and a prominent family whose name wasn't even in the letter, and a household she'd be managing for people who would never slide a bowl of stew toward her without being asked. She thought about Rosie's song that morning. She thought about Thomas's face when he'd found her error in the bean sack count. She thought about the Sunday afternoon with the plant book spread on the table between her and Evelyn, and the way Evelyn had said, "I'll use it right," with all that careful intention in her voice. She left the letter on the table. She didn't answer that night. She told Gideon she needed to think, and he nodded like that was fair, because it was fair, and she went to the sewing room and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands flat on her knees and breathed the way she'd learned to breathe when things were hard and she needed to think clearly. She picked up her mother's plant book. She opened it to the back, to the list she'd been keeping since October. The first list of what was in the larder that first morning. The list of what she'd gathered at the creek. The 11-week calculation. The daily counts during the storm. And at the very back, on the last page, A list she'd started without knowing she was starting it. Not provisions, not plants, just words. Single words, sometimes two, entries with no dates, no context, no system. Words like Rosy Tuesday, Thomas Harness, Evelyn arms down, coffee for two, blue cloth, hinge on door. She looked at the list for a long time. She hadn't known she was keeping it. She thought she was noting things, the way she noted everything. But looking at it now, she could see what it actually was. A record of the ways this place had accumulated in her, one small, irreversible thing at a time, until the accumulation was heavier than $42 a month and a room in Denver and every kind of security she'd spent her adult life reaching for. She closed the book. She made her decision, and she was at peace with it, in the particular way you're at peace with something you've already known for a long time and are just now catching up to. The next morning, she came into the kitchen to find Evelyn already there, which was unusual. Evelyn stood at the kitchen shelf with her back to the door, and she was holding the red recipe book. Marin's book. Her hands were very careful with it, the way you hold something you've been not holding for 2 years and have finally picked up. She heard Eliza come in, and she turned, and her face was the most open Eliza had ever seen it. Not crying, not quite, but close to the edge of something. "I've been thinking," Evelyn said, "that someone should use this." Her voice was careful and deliberate, every word placed. The mama would have hated it just sitting there. She looked down at the book in her hands. She would have thought it was wasteful. She hated waste. "She sounds like she was very practical," Eliza said. "She was." Evelyn looked up. "Like you." The words landed simply, without drama, which was the most Evelyn way for them to land. Evelyn walked to the table and set the book down and opened it to the first page. Marin's handwriting, Eliza could see from across the kitchen, slanted and quick and confident. And then she looked up at Eliza with an expression that was both an offering and a question. "Will you help me learn them?" she said. "The recipes. Properly." Eliza came to the table. She looked at the open page. Marin Ashcroft's handwriting looked like someone who had written quickly because she had better things to do, which Eliza found immediately likable. "Yes," she said. "I'll help you learn them." Evelyn nodded. She didn't say anything else. She touched the edge of the page carefully and then went to the stove to start the oatmeal, and Eliza sat down at the table with the red book open in front of her, in the morning light of a kitchen that had started to smell like spring, even though spring wasn't here yet, and she understood exactly what had just been handed to her and why. It was the most valuable thing in the house. Evelyn had put it in her hands. She answered Mrs. Pell's letter that afternoon. She wrote it at the kitchen table in her small, precise handwriting, and she thanked Mrs. Pell for the offer and the kind words about her capabilities, and she declined. She said she had found a position that suited her. She didn't elaborate. She sealed the letter and gave it to Thomas to take down to the post office on his next trip to town, and he took it without asking what was in it, which was the right thing to do. Gideon was in the yard when she came back out, working on the barn door that had been giving trouble all winter. He looked up when she came into the yard. She wasn't sure what her face was doing, but whatever it was doing told him something because his hands stilled on the door, and he looked at her with a question he wasn't asking. "I wrote to Mrs. Pell," she said. He waited. "I'm staying," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The barn door was between them, half hung. The light was the thin, bright light of a February afternoon that was trying to be something warmer than it was. His face did something that she didn't try to classify, something that moved through and was gone before it could be named. "All right," he said. It was the wrong word for what the moment was, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. He turned back to the barn door. She went back inside. But she was smiling when she did, and she didn't stop when she got through the door, because there was no one in the kitchen yet to see it, and she let herself have it, the whole undignified warmth of it, for 30 seconds before Rosie appeared from around the corner, still singing the song about the horse and the honey, and Eliza went to the stove and started on the afternoon meal. March came in cold, but not vicious, the way March came when the worst of it was already behind. The snowmelt started slow on the south-facing slopes, the ones Eliza knew best by now. The ones she'd walked in November and December and January collecting things, and she started walking them again in the early mornings, noting what was coming up, what would be harvestable in 6 weeks, what to prepare for. Evelyn sometimes came with her. When she did, she brought a small notebook she'd started keeping, and she wrote things down while Eliza pointed them out, and she asked better questions every time, the specific, precise questions of someone building a real framework rather than just collecting interesting facts. Thomas had taken over the morning count entirely. He'd expanded it, not just provisions, but a log of what the late calf ate and how much it was growing, a tracking of the wood supply against the remaining cold weeks, a notation system for which fence sections needed work in spring. He showed it to Gideon one evening at the table, and Gideon looked at it for a long time, and then looked at his son and said something with his face that he didn't say with words, and Thomas received it the same way. Clara's cold didn't come back after February. She was not the kind of child who tolerated being indoors gracefully, and as the days lengthened, she spent more time in the yard and less time underfoot, which was good for everyone, including Clara. Rosie asked Eliza one morning, with the directness that was Rosie's particular gift, "Are you going to live here forever?" Eliza was at the stove. "I don't know about forever," she said. "I'm here for now." Rosie considered this with her head tilted. "But you're not leaving tomorrow." "No, not tomorrow." "Or next week." "No." Rosie nodded, apparently satisfied with this incremental commitment. "Okay," she said, and went back to the drawing she was making of the brown horse. The conversation with Gideon that needed to happen happened on a Sunday evening in mid-March after supper, after the children were in bed. It happened because they were both in the kitchen and neither of them left, and enough had built up between them that the not saying of it had become its own kind of pressure. He said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "All right." He said, "Not tonight. I want to do it right. I want—" He stopped and rubbed his hand over his face in the gesture she'd come to know as him frustrated with himself. "I want to take you back to town first. I want to do something before I ask." She looked at him. "You're being mysterious." "I'm being—" A breath. "I want to do it right. I've done most things wrong for 2 years, and I want to do this one right." She looked at him for a moment, the fire, the lamp, his face, which she could read much better now than she'd been able to in October, the small tells of it, the way the corner of his jaw moved when he was holding something in. "All right," she said. "Next Saturday," he said. "Town." "All right," she said again. He picked up his coffee cup. She went back to the plant book she'd been reading, but the warmth that had been in her since the morning she said, "I'm staying," was still there, steady and ordinary, and more real than $42 a month had ever felt, and she turned the pages of her mother's book in the lamplight and let it be what it was. Outside, the mountain was beginning, very slowly, to give back what it had taken. The snow on the south slopes was down to patches. The creek she'd walked all winter was running fast and loud. There were things coming up at the creek edges that she'd been watching for. Small green things that knew the cold was breaking before the calendar did. And she had a list of what to collect first and what to do with it, written on the last page of her mother's book in her small, precise handwriting, next to the other list, the one that said Rosie Tuesday and Thomas Harness and Blue Cloth and Hinge on Door. She didn't add to that list anymore. She didn't need to. She already knew what it said. Saturday came the way important days sometimes do, ordinary on the outside, unremarkable in its weather, giving no indication that it intended to matter. Eliza was up at her usual hour, fire first, water on, and she told herself this was just a trip to town and there was no reason to treat it as anything else until she knew what it was. She pinned her hair more carefully than usual and put on the dress she'd mended twice, but that still sat well on her, and she did not let herself think too hard about what Gideon had said. "I want to do it right," because thinking too hard about it was the fastest way to arrive somewhere disappointed. Gideon had the wagon ready before the children were up. He'd brushed the horses, which he didn't always do for a town run, and he'd put a clean blanket on the wagon seat against the March cold, which he'd also never done before. Eliza noticed these things and filed them carefully in the back of her mind where she kept things she wasn't ready to look at directly. The children erupted at breakfast when they understood that both Eliza and their father were going to town together and they were not. "I want to come," Rosie said, in the particular tone of a 4-year-old who has already decided the answer is negotiable. "Evelyn's in charge. Gideon said, which was always what he said when he left. But this time Evelyn didn't make the face she usually made when she was handed the mantle of responsibility she'd been carrying for 2 years and resented even as she accepted it. This time Evelyn looked at Eliza over the heads of the younger children with an expression that Eliza couldn't quite categorize. Knowing, maybe, or something adjacent to knowing, with the thread of something else underneath that was warmer than Evelyn usually allowed herself to show. "We'll be back before supper," Eliza told Rosie. "Promise?" "Yes." Rosie accepted this and went back to her oatmeal. Clara was already drawing something on the back of Thomas's almanac, which Thomas had not yet noticed. Thomas was looking at the window with the expression he'd developed lately of a boy calculating something about the weather. They went down the north road in the wagon, Gideon driving, Eliza beside him with the blanket across her lap because the March morning still had real cold in it, even if the afternoon wouldn't. The road was passable now, the deep winter ruts softening as the ground thawed, and the mountain on either side was doing what mountains did in early spring, looking severe and gray and bare while secretly producing small green things in every south-facing crease and hollow that you'd only see if you were looking for them, which Eliza always was. They didn't talk much on the road. They had gotten comfortable with the particular silence between two people who don't need to fill space, and the wagon moved through it with the creak and sway that Eliza had come to find settling rather than uncomfortable. She was watching the slope on her right when Gideon said, "I should have asked you sooner." She turned to look at him. He was watching the road. "Ask me what?" she said, though she had a reasonable idea. "To stay. Properly." His jaw moved. Not the way it happened, where you said it and I said all right. That wasn't right." "It felt right to me," she said. "You deserved more than all right," he said. She looked at him for a moment. He was still watching the road, doing the thing he did where he delivered something important into the middle distance rather than directly at her, which she had stopped finding frustrating weeks ago and had started finding, she wasn't sure. Endearing was a word she'd been avoiding, so she left it unnamed. "Gideon," she said, "the way things happened between us, the way they built, slowly, out of necessity and work, and that terrible storm, that's not a lesser thing than if it had been done properly from the start. Some things are better for being built slow." He was quiet. Then, "That's generous." "It's accurate," she said. "I don't do generous for its own sake. You know that about me by now." He made a sound that was the nearest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him in conversation, which was different from the sounds he sometimes made when Thomas said something dry or when Rosie did something that caught him off guard. This one was quieter, more internal. She felt it more than heard it. They came into Ash Hollow from the North Road, and Eliza felt, as she always felt when she came to town, which had been 3 times since October, twice for provisions, and once because Clara needed boots, the slight readjustment of being in a place where people could see her. The ranch had its own weather system, its own rules, and town was a different set of both. Gideon brought the wagon to the hitching post near the general store and helped her down. He'd started doing this in January, offering his hand without comment, and she'd started taking it without comment, and neither of them had made anything of it, which was perhaps what made it something. And they went into the store for the things on the provisions list that they genuinely needed anyway, because Eliza had made sure there was a real list so the trip had a real errand and didn't feel like something being staged. The store was run by a man named Pritchard, who had one of those faces that looked permanently surprised and who had always been decent to Eliza, in the careful way of a man who'd heard the story of the train platform and had his own opinion of Walter Greer that he kept professional. He greeted them both and helped with the flour and the oil and the particular type of seed Eliza wanted for the kitchen garden she was planning to start in April, and the transaction was ordinary and fine. It was when they came out of the store that she saw Walter Greer. He was across the street, outside the land office, talking to another man with the self-important stance he had when he wanted to be seen talking to someone in public. He saw them at the same moment they could see him, and his face did something complicated. Recognition, reassessment, and then the particular expression of a man deciding in real time what kind of face to put forward. He excused himself from the other man and walked across the street. Eliza felt Gideon register this beside her. Not a movement, just a slight change in the quality of his stillness, the way a man changes when something that might require a response comes walking toward him. She kept her own face easy. She had decided months ago, standing in the yard in the snow with a shovel while Walter rode away, that she was done being rearranged by Walter Greer's proximity. "Eliza," Walter said when he reached them. He'd put on the good-natured face, the one she recognized from his letters, reasonable, self-aware. A man who had done a thing and wanted you to know he knew it. "You're looking well." "Walter," she said. Just the name. Nothing attached. He glanced at Gideon with the look that men gave each other when they were trying to take a measurement. "Ashcroft," he said. "Greer," Gideon said, in the way he said most things. Without inflection, without warmth, without particular hostility either, just a word being returned. Walter looked back at Eliza. She could see him recalibrating, trying to find the angle that worked. He had done this in the yard in December too, and he hadn't found it then, and she didn't think he was going to find it now, but she waited to see what he had. "I heard you turned down a position in Denver," he said. "Good salary." "I did," she said. "I thought you might reconsider that," he said. There was something slightly off in the way he said it. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. The half-formed structure of someone who had rehearsed something and was now discovering the rehearsal didn't fit. "I've already declined," she said. "It's settled." "Eliza." He lowered his voice to the register of private conversation, which was slightly absurd in the middle of a public street, but she didn't say so. "I know I handled things badly. I've said so. But a woman in your position, Mr. Greer," she said. He stopped. "What you said to me on that platform in October," she said, "I haven't forgotten it, and I'm not going to, but it doesn't sit in me the way it did then. I want you to know that." She kept her voice level and clear. "I came to Ash Hollow with nothing, and what I've built here is mine. Not because someone gave it to me, but because I showed up every morning and did the work, and that's not nothing. It's not something you can come back and renegotiate." Walter looked at her. His face had the slightly stripped expression of a man who had come prepared for a different conversation. "You're happy here," he said. It came out more like a statement than he'd intended, she thought. Something he was recognizing rather than challenging. "I'm where I want to be," she said. He looked at Gideon. Whatever he was looking for there, some opening, some uncertainty, some lever, he didn't find it. Gideon looked back at him with the patient, settled quality of a man who had nowhere better to be. Walter Greer put his hat on. "Good day, then," he said, and walked back across the street and did not look back. And Eliza watched him go with the sensation of setting down something she hadn't realized she was still carrying, lighter than she'd expected, after everything. 6 months ago, that man's opinion of her had nearly destroyed her. Standing here now, she understood clearly and without any particular drama that his opinion had never actually been about her at all. It had been about what he'd wanted her to be, and the failure of that picture. And a man like Walter Greer needed somewhere to put that failure, and he'd put it on her, and she had let herself carry it all the way from Millfield. She wasn't carrying it anymore. Gideon said beside her, "You all right?" "Yes," she said, and then, "Yes, actually." He looked at her with a slight question in his eyes. "It's just—" She thought about how to say it. "The last time I was near him, I could barely hold my face still, and now he's just a man I used to know who made a mistake." She looked at Gideon. "That's what happens when you build something real. Everything that wasn't real just gets smaller." Gideon looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Come on," and touched her elbow. Not grabbing, just a direction, and walked her down the main street, past the general store and the bank and the side street where Mrs. Calloway's rooming house was, the one she'd walked past in October with $2 in her pocket. He stopped in front of a small building she hadn't paid attention to before, between the post office and the land office. It had a bench outside it and a window with a dry arrangement of winter grasses in it that someone had made carefully. "What is this?" she said. "Justice of the peace," he said. He was looking at the building, not at her, in that way he had. Also notary, also does contracts and witnessing and the other official things. He paused. Also marriages. The street was quiet around them. Somewhere behind them a horse shifted and the harness jingled. Eliza looked at the building. She looked at Gideon. He still wasn't looking at her, which she recognized as the posture of someone saying the most important thing they'd said in years, and needing to not see the other person's face while they said it. "Gideon," she said softly. He turned then. His face was the most unguarded she'd seen it, and it cost him something to have it that way. She could see the cost of it, and she understood that for a man like him, this was the equivalent of everything. "I know it's not the way it should be done," he said. "I know I should have. I know there are things I should have said sooner and better, and I didn't, and I can't undo that. But I want to do this right, what's left of right." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to marry me, Eliza. Not because you keep us alive, though you did. Not because the children need you, though they do. Because when I think about next winter and the one after that, the thing I think about isn't the provisions or the fence or the cattle." He stopped. "It's you, at the table, in the morning, your handwriting on the jars." Something moved in his face. "I'd like that to be mine to keep." Eliza looked at him. She thought about October, about that platform, about standing with her bag and her $2 and a laugh that had aimed to diminish her. She thought about all the mornings since then, the dark ones and the cold ones, and the ones during the storm when she wasn't sure they were going to come out the other side. She thought about the plant book and the shelves in the sewing room, and the jar of rose hip powder with her handwriting on it, and a harness in the barn fixed by two people figuring it out together, and a hinge on a door that had been sticking and quietly wasn't anymore. She thought about what she had built here, in this house, in this mountain, in these people. Not what had been given to her. What she had built with her own hands and her own knowing and her own stubborn insistence on showing up every morning regardless. And she understood, standing here in front of the justice of the peace, in a town that had once watched her be left behind, that this was not a rescue. It had never been a rescue. She had not been saved by this family. She and this family had, together, in the particular grinding, unglamorous way of real things, saved each other. "Yes," she said. He breathed out. It was the smallest sound, but she heard everything in it. They were married that afternoon by a justice of the peace named Abner Colum, who smelled of pipe tobacco and performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done it many times and still found it worth doing carefully. There were no flowers. There were no guests. There were two witnesses pulled from the post office next door. A woman named Ruth, who did not know either of them and shook both their hands warmly anyway, and a young man who was picking up a parcel and looked slightly alarmed to find himself witnessing a wedding, but signed his name when asked. Eliza did not cry. She had told herself she wouldn't, and she didn't, but it was closer than she'd expected in the moment when Abner Colm said the last of it, and Gideon took her hand and she felt the realness of it. Not the ceremony, not the words, but the hand, which she knew by now, the specific roughness of his palm from the work it had done for 15 years on this ranch. They were in the wagon, heading back up the north road by 3 in the afternoon. The mountain was gold and gray in the late light, and the creek was audible below the road, running fast with snowmelt. Gideon's hand found hers on the seat between them without any particular announcement, and she left hers where it was, and they went up the mountain in the long afternoon light, and neither of them needed to say anything, and so they didn't. They came into the yard to find all 4 children in the front of the house. Rosie spotted the wagon first and came running with the full-body commitment that only very young children still had, and she arrived at the wagon before it had fully stopped and looked up at both of them with enormous eyes. "Did something happen?" Rosie demanded. "Something happened," Eliza agreed. "What?" Gideon climbed down from the wagon and lifted Rosie up in one arm and said into her hair, "Eliza's staying." "She was already staying," Rosie said reasonably. "More official now," he said. Rosie pulled back and looked at his face, and then at Eliza's, and whatever she saw in both of them seemed to satisfy something, because she settled against her father's shoulder and said, "Okay," with the serenity of someone whose assessment of the situation had been validated. Thomas was standing at the edge of the yard with his hands in his pockets. He'd heard. She could see that he'd heard and was processing it with the particular inward stillness he brought to things that mattered to him. She got down from the wagon and walked to him and stopped. He looked at her. He was 10 years old, and he was the most careful person she'd met since her mother, and she respected him for it the way she'd respected her mother for it. "Is that all right?" she said. "With you?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, in the deliberate way he said things he'd decided to say, "You found the error in the bean count before I did." She waited. "I wouldn't have caught it for another day," he said. "We might have been short." He looked at his boots and then back at her. "I'm glad you're staying." It was the most Thomas sentence she could have been given, and she received it as the enormous thing it was. Clara's response was to grab Eliza's hand and pull her inside to show her a drawing she'd made that morning, which turned out to be a picture of the whole family at the kitchen table, and which included, without apparent deliberation, 6 chairs and 6 people. Eliza looked at the drawing for a long moment. 6 chairs, 6 people, drawn by a 7-year-old who had simply drawn the truth as she saw it. She looked at Clara. "This is wonderful," she said. "I know," Clara said, with the serene confidence of a 7-year-old, and went to hang it on the kitchen wall. Evelyn was last. She had stayed in the kitchen, Eliza realized when she came in, and she had been cooking. The kitchen smelled of something good, something with onion and the rosemary Eliza had dried in December and salt pork used as a flavoring the way Eliza had shown her, stretching through the whole pot. Marin's recipe book was open on the shelf above the stove, to a page with a water stain on the corner and handwriting that Eliza had come to recognize as having been written in a hurry. Evelyn turned from the stove. Her face was doing the Evelyn thing of controlling itself, but the control was slightly looser than usual, and underneath it was something that was purely, undeniably glad. "I started supper," she said. "I can see that. It smells good. It's Mama's recipe, the winter stew." She turned back to the stove. "I thought tonight should be something real." Eliza set down her things and stood in the kitchen of the house she lived in, the house where her handwriting was on the jars, and her mother's book was on the floor beside the bed, and her list was in the back of the plant book, and her name was now on the deed that Gideon had mentioned quietly, driving up the mountain, as something he'd arranged this week because it should have been arranged already. She stood in the kitchen and let it be real. All of it. The stew and the drawing on the wall and Thomas's bean counts on the shelf, and Rosie's voice starting up again from somewhere in the house, the horse song, the honey song, the song about Edith, and Gideon coming through the back door and hanging his hat and going to wash his hands the way he did every evening, and then sitting at the table and looking at her with the quiet, settled look of a man who had done one thing completely right. She got down the bowls. 6 of them. Supper was loud in the way that suppers had gotten loud over the winter, which was still new enough to notice. All 4 children talking over each other, Thomas occasionally cutting through with one precise sentence that changed the direction of the conversation, Rosie changing subjects with no transition, Clara providing editorial commentary on everything with the authority of someone who believed strongly in her own opinions. Gideon ate and listened and occasionally said something that cut to the center of whatever argument was happening, and Eliza ate the winter stew that Evelyn had made from her mother's recipe and thought that Marin Ashcroft had known what she was doing with onion and rosemary. When the bowls were cleared, Evelyn went to the breadbasket and took out the last biscuit. There were never enough biscuits. Eliza hadn't yet found the math that produced enough biscuits for this family, and set it in front of Eliza, not in the middle of the table, not offered around, directly in front of Eliza. Everyone at the table saw it. Nobody said anything about it. Rosie looked at the biscuit and then at Eliza with a nod of profound approval. Thomas looked at his empty bowl. Clara had already moved on to something else. Gideon looked at Evelyn with an expression that said something between them that didn't need Eliza present to be real. Eliza looked at the biscuit. 6 months ago, she had stood on a platform and been laughed at by a man who looked at her size and decided that was all she was. 6 months ago, she had walked 4 miles up a mountain road and knocked on a door and said, "I will work for 1 meal a day," because it was the only thing she had left to offer. She had slept under a grandmother's quilt in a cold room that smelled of someone else's lavender, and told herself not to want too much because wanting too much was how you ended up on a platform. She looked at the biscuit. She looked at Evelyn, who was looking at the table with her chin at its usual angle, but with something different in the set of her shoulders, open somehow, deliberate. "Thank you," Eliza said. Evelyn said without looking up, "You've been giving us the smaller piece all winter." A pause. I noticed in January, I didn't say anything because I didn't know how. She finally looked at Eliza. You don't have to do that anymore. The kitchen held that sentence for a moment. Eliza picked up the biscuit. She ate it without ceremony because ceremony would have ruined it. And it was good. Evelyn had been getting better. The biscuits were genuinely getting better. And around her, the table noise picked back up, Rosie demanding to know if the brown horse could have a biscuit too. Thomas pointing out that horses didn't eat biscuits, Clara arguing that this particular horse probably would, and Gideon's hand finding hers under the table with the same lack of announcement as in the wagon, warm and certain, and not going anywhere. Here's what Eliza Harrow had learned, and what she carried forward from that October platform into every morning that came after. That worth was not a thing other people assigned you. It was a thing you demonstrated quietly and without ceasing in every cold morning and every thin meal and every fence line held and every sick child and every list written in small handwriting in the back of your mother's book. Nobody gives you worth. You build it the way you build anything real. Slowly, imperfectly, with your own hands in the particular weather of your own life. That showing up was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the main thing. Not showing up beautifully or showing up perfectly or showing up after you'd made yourself acceptable to someone else's measurement. Just showing up with what you had and beginning. That families were not born. They were made. They were made in kitchens at 4 a.m. and in barns with difficult harnesses and in the dark of a storm when everyone was frightened and someone had to be the one who was not frightened, or at least who was frightened and showed up anyway. They were made in the particular, unglamorous accumulation of ordinary days until the ordinary days became something that held together from the inside. And that the people who had laughed at her, Walter Greer on his platform, everyone who had ever looked at her and seen only the size of her body and decided they already knew the size of her worth, those people were not the measure. They had never been the measure. She had made the mistake of treating their measurements as real, and it had cost her years, and she was done with that particular cost. The mountain spring came in with its usual mixture of mud and cold and sudden warmth and the smell of things growing that hadn't been growing last week. The kitchen garden Eliza had planned all winter went into the ground in the first week of April, and Evelyn helped and Rosie helped in the way that Rosie helped everything, which was to say with enormous enthusiasm and approximate accuracy. Thomas dug the rows because Thomas was good at straight lines. Clara planted the seeds with more care than she applied to most things because she had decided the garden was going to be a project of hers specifically, and she took her projects seriously. Gideon built raised beds on the south side of the house because Eliza had mentioned that Marin had tried to grow things in the mountain soil and failed, and raised beds with hauled soil held the heat differently. He didn't announce he was doing it. She came around the side of the house one morning, and they were there, 3 of them, solid and square, and she stood and looked at them for a moment. Later she said, "The beds." He said, "Marin would have liked that, having something that worked." It was the first time he'd brought Marin into a conversation this way. Not the tight, controlled references he sometimes made when something touched the edges of her, but directly, with her name, in the present tense of what she would have liked. Eliza understood this for what it was, a man finding a way to carry both. Not replacing, carrying both. The woman who had built this home and the woman who had come to it half dead in October and rebuilt what the grief had let fall. There was room for that. There was always room for that, if you didn't make it a competition. By May, the ranch had come through, not through in the way of disaster survived and everything returned to normal, but through in the way of something genuinely transformed, smaller than before in some ways, larger in others, realigned around a different center of gravity. The late calf, now not so late, was out in the pasture with the others. The fence lines were solid. Thomas's tracking system for provisions had been adopted by Gideon without ceremony as simply how they did things now. Evelyn had cooked 5 dishes from Marin's book and declared 2 of them better than she'd expected and 1 of them in need of adjustment, which Eliza agreed with, and they had adjusted it together, and Evelyn had written the adjustment in her own notebook in her own handwriting below the copy she'd made of the original, the way you annotate something that's become yours. The sheriff, Holloway, came by in May to check on things in the way that he sometimes did, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and looked at the ranch with the expression of a man comparing what he saw to what he remembered. "The place looks different," he said. "Spring," Eliza said. He shook his head slightly. Not the season. He looked at her. You. She didn't say anything. I felt responsible, he said. Sending you up here, not knowing how it would go. It went fine, she said. I can see that. He turned his hat in his hands. Walter Greer left town last month. Moved south, I heard. All right, she said. She felt nothing particular about it, which was the right amount of feeling. Holloway nodded, satisfied with something. He put his hat back on. Good morning to you, Mrs. Ashcroft, he said, and rode back down the road. Mrs. Ashcroft. She stood in the yard and let the name land in her. She had not yet gotten used to hearing it from other people, though she'd been signing it for 6 weeks. There was still a small pause in her chest when she heard it, a fraction of a second where her body caught up to what her life had become. Not a bad pause. A full one. The way a breath is full when you've been holding it for a long time and finally let it go. Rosie came around the corner of the house at a run, as Rosie came everywhere, and grabbed Eliza's hand with both of hers and pulled. Come see, she said. The seeds are coming up, the ones I planted. Come see. Eliza let herself be pulled around to the south side of the house, to the raised beds that Gideon had built in the soil he'd hauled, to the small green things that were just beginning to push through. Tentative, exact, knowing what they were even when they were barely started. Rosie crouched down next to the bed and pointed with one small finger at the nearest sprout. That one's mine, she said. I planted that one. You did, Eliza agreed. It's going to be a big plant, Rosie said with absolute certainty. Eliza crouched down beside her. The soil was warm from the morning sun, and the small green thing was pushing up through it with the particular tenacity of things that had been seeds all winter, in the cold and the dark, and had come through to this. Yes, Eliza said. It is. And it was.